Secrets to building a great product that doesn't blow the budget. What I've done with today's topic is divided it into sort of like three sort of broad points, and then some sort of sub points for each one of those. So the first one here is when we're trying to build a great digital product that's going to really wow users, create something that users love without breaking the budget, is going to be getting clarity. And so first, before I dive into getting clarity, let's think about what is one of the big recurring themes or challenges within software product development that people will see a whole lot. One is that they're notorious for going over budget, which is kind of what we talked about in the title a little bit. But also, two, they're plagued by other problems, such as maybe not building the right thing, missing the mark, not building something that's valuable, not really understanding their user. They're plagued with going beyond schedule, right? In addition to budget, those are usually tied together. And so what I aimed at trying to do in today's session is let's talk about how can we balance building a really great product that's going to add value for users at the same time, like staying within sort of a target budget and target timeline that we know that we should expect. So the first one here of like get clarity is sort of the first step that I thought we should talk about. And so when we're trying to get clarity, oftentimes you'll hear me talk about that clarity is the antidote to risk, right? And what I mean by that is the more clear we get about things, everything, why are we building this? Why should it exist? What's the value that it's going to provide? How are we going to build it? Who's going to build it? How much is it going to cost? How long is it going to take? All those kinds of things. The more clarity we get, the less risk we have, right? And the less likelihood is that we end up blowing the budget, or we end up going beyond schedule, or we just build a product that fails when we launch it, right? And the trick around clarity is what's the right level of clarity, right? Like you can go really deep and really wide on sort of this front of being clear on things, but what really is appropriate for the product that you're building, right? So what we're trying to do in this exercise, and what I'd encourage you to try to think about, is what's the appropriate level of clarity that we need before we start building for this particular product. And that's going to vary a whole lot. Some products are very large, complex, and sort of your minimum version of that is going to be kind of big. Other times, maybe it's small, maybe even to the point where you could do like a small like proof of concept or test in order to kind of go to the next step. So the first question under getting clarity is, why are we building this? And so this is sort of revisiting at a high level our premise behind building the product. What problem does it solve? How valuable is it? Are there a lack of alternatives in the marketplace that people have available, right? Or people really needing this and they don't really have a way to solve the issue that they're going after, right? So being very clear on sort of your overriding premise on why are we building this? We oftentimes call this concept the MLP, the minimum lovable product. And some of you may have heard of MVP, minimum viable product. It's a very common term in the space. We've really come to believe that MVP is a very flawed way. It's an old way. It's not the right way to build and launch successful software products. Instead, we think MLP. And the distinction is basically this. MVP is about the product. MLP is about the users, right? So if we focus on the users, what's going to make this lovable by the users? What are the elements of this product that make it lovable? Then we have a much better chance of success, right? So why are we building this? Next is, what problem does it solve? So being very clear on what is the problem statement? How does our solution fulfill that need or solve that problem? And even beyond that, you can also think about like, who is this problem being solved for, right? Because we've run into circumstances that may be a little bit rare, but I have seen situations where there's a definite problem and the product would definitely solve that, but the people that the product would solve that problem for aren't really decision makers. And ultimately, they're not the ones that would be able to approve spending money on this. And so that could pose a problem to your product launch if you're solving a real problem for real users, but those users aren't the ones that make the financial decisions that would help fund the product, right? The other thing to keep in mind about when we're being clear about what product to solve is this problem big enough? Is this a minor inconvenience that people can live with? Or is this a really big, complex problem that has big dollars associated to it? So being clear about what it is the problem is that we're solving, how big is that problem, can help you really gauge and be clear and confident that you should actually build something, right? The next one is, have we defined success clearly? Like, begin with the end in mind, right? So if we build the product, if we launch the product, what would success look like? How would we know, right? And so I've talked about, this concept of minimum viable analytics as one mechanism for sort of monitoring and measuring that. But you should have some success criteria that's clearly defined before you actually set out on building a product, right? So that way you know whether you've hit the target or not. Another element of clarity would be what I would sort of classify as stakeholder alignment. And that sounds really broad, and it kind of is, right? Stakeholders could include team members, investors, executives or the engineer team, designers, testers, customer experience, sales, if there's people that are providing financing, like, so it's anybody who has sort of a stake in this product, right? And so stakeholder alignment helps eliminate a lot of the problems that don't really have anything to do with the product itself specifically, but you'd be surprised how many times product launch efforts get put back because there's not alignment among the different stakeholders. And that's alignment among all the things that I've talked about so far. What's the problem statement? What is the product going to do? Why should we build this? What's the value proposition? How are we going to build it? What's the technology we're going to use to build it? What's it going to look like? How much is it going to cost? How long is it going to take? How do we define success? What are our milestones? All those different elements, the more clear you get about that, and then you communicate that clarity out to the various stakeholders, helps everyone stay aligned, right? And then the last one that I was going to mention under this point of getting clarity is, how well do we really understand the user, right? So I'm sort of embarrassed to admit early on how many different software product development efforts I've been a part of where we did not start with a clear set of user personas and a user journey or a customer journey, right? Those are two tools that we use a lot today that I think really provide a lot of foundation for being clear about a lot of the things that we already talked about, right? So if you can better understand who's going to be using this, how are they currently doing this today, or what's the journey that they would go through, and where does your product sort of intersect in that journey, and how does it solve those pains, it begins to get really clear. So having a really good understanding of the user can help you be very clear on what your product is going to be and why you should build it. So the second main point is have a plan, right? I think there's sort of this debate that comes up a lot that, you have to be either waterfall or you have to be agile. And, agile purists say, well, we don't do that because, that's waterfall, right? We're agile, right? And, I'm a huge fan of agile, right? I'm not so much a fan of waterfall. However, there's some elements of the waterfall approach that I do think you need to keep in mind. And so being agile doesn't mean that you don't have a broader, more high level plan, right? You need to have a zoomed out view of things, where you're trying to go and what are your sort of key checkpoints or milestones. And then you can use agile within that plan to help execute on that, right? And so one of the mechanisms that I talk a little bit about is something I call validation gates, right? And what I mean when I talk about validation gates is we've got this vision for the product. We are going to build this and launch it. But validation gates are sort of these checkpoints where you identify certain key objectives that you're looking to achieve and sort of an ability to get to that checkpoint and validate that you've fulfilled the success criteria for passing through that gate and going to the next step. So an example of a validation gate could be this. It could be early on in your planning, you're focusing more on, design, right? And user experience, perhaps before you've even started developing anything. One of your validation gates could be, hey, we know our target users. We have access to a sample group of these user personas or these target users. So we're going to build a prototype, a design prototype, and we're going to review it with these users and get feedback, right? That could be a validation gate. Now, let's say you go through that process, you get that feedback from those potential users that can inform you a whole lot of, hey, you're definitely onto something. And what happens is it builds your confidence and you, again, take a step to reduce risk before moving on to the next step of maybe actually building like a working version of the product. So as you're looking at your product development sort of plan or your roadmap, think, where can I have smart validation gates along the way where I can sort of check to make sure that we are getting the validation we want, we're on the right track, and we're more confident sort of moving to the next step. The next item here under have a plan is, what do we build first, right? It's very common that the product vision is very big, right? But a simple example of this would be, if you think about a common product that all of us use, take something like Facebook or Gmail or something like that, right? Keep in mind that the version of that product that you're using today is not what the first version of that product looked like when they first launched it, right? It's a natural life cycle to build something, and as it's successful, you continue to improve it, right? So keep that in mind when you're trying to figure out like what it is that we need to build first so that we can get users. And this is where the concept of the MLP, or the minimum lovable product, comes back in, because that's a great way to sort of understand what that might look like. What you want to focus on is, I've got this big vision of my product. What is the minimum lovable version of that product? Maybe it's something small, but it's very valuable. So we can start with something that we know users will love. We can build that, launch that. And again, that's another validation gate. We've got more confidence to move forward. We've got more validation because we know that users are willing to use it. And then it's a matter of continuing down our roadmap. So being clear about, what do we build first? What is needed to launch this in order to get users, right? Next would be, what's the technical approach? Like, what should the technical approach be? This can include a lot of different things. And based on the type of product that you're building, there's sort of varying degrees that make sense for this type of item. But this could include things like being very clear on, what's the target platform? Is this something that you really have to launch across multiple platforms like web, mobile, iOS, Android, all at the same time? Or can you start with something like a web version that's maybe responsive design or a PWA, and then perhaps down your roadmap build native apps? So being clear about, what's the target platform, what's the tech stack, what are we going to use to build this, right? This is a pitfall that you'll see a lot of times, where people are building a product and the tech stack really gets selected based on what the resources are comfortable using. So if you're working with a third-party vendor or a partner, if they happen to have those types of resources on their bench or available, or if that's what they happen to use a lot of, oftentimes your tech stack gets picked based on criteria that's not really best for the product, right? So being clear about tech stack, what integrations you're going to need, high level architecture, where's your infrastructure going to reside? These are types of things that you want to be clear about, like in your technical approach. The next one is a design prototype. I often talk about how big of a fan I am of the design prototype as one of the artifacts before building a product, mainly because I feel like a design prototype does a better job than almost any other tool of really helping align stakeholders, which I talked about a few minutes ago. So if you can create a design prototype, which really gives you a good picture of, here's what the product's going to look like, here's how it's going to flow, Here's how you work through it. You can use that to help get everybody on the same page that may not talk the same language, right? So you could show it to investors so they can see the picture about like, well, how does this work? And they can really kind of understand the concept. You can use it to communicate to the developers. This is what we're building, right? You can communicate to your QA team or your testers so that they help understand what to expect back from development. So it's a really great way to align everybody. It's also a relative to development. It's a very inexpensive way to make changes and rethink things. I use the example or the analogy of, you know, if it takes $1 to make a change in a design prototype, it may take $1,000 to make that same change or more once you've already developed it, right? So exploring, making changes, getting feedback, making adjustments during the design prototype phase is a much more efficient way to handle it versus diving in, building something and then figuring out this isn't really right. The next one around having a plan is a really important one. And it's how much budget do we need? So there's been times where I've seen projects where had the customer known what the real budget was going to be, they may have made a different decision on whether they would have actually built it or what they would have built, right? So being clear about what it is you're going to build, what that's going to include or not include, and what's the budget that sort of overlays that roadmap, that's a really important element to help make these decisions, right? So the plan definitely needs to have clarity around budget. And even that, it needs to have you need to have a high degree of confidence that you have enough fidelity or clarity around what the assumptions are behind the budget numbers so that you have confidence that that budget, you know, should stand up. The last one here sort of relates to budget, but it's around timeline. How long is it going to take? Right. So, you know, budget and timeline tend to tie together. So oftentimes if you go twice as long over the timeline, you end up going twice over the budget or more. So this plan, you know, has these elements of what are we building? What's it going to look like? How are we going to build it? But also how much is it going to cost and how long will it take? And then the third main point out of three is you need to make sure that you assemble the right team, right? This is a misstep that has plagued many projects, right? And this can affect what kind of product you actually end up building if you're able to launch it, and you know, making sure that you don't blow the budget. So really identifying what's the right team for your effort. How do you assemble that team? And are they achieving the objectives, right? It's going to be really important. So let's dive into a few things here on this that are worth thinking about. The first one is what roles will need to be accounted for. And what I mean by that is this is a team sport building a product, right? And it takes a variety of skill sets to really do a product well. Even if it's a smaller, more simple product, it's very rare that one single person possesses the level of skill across the variety of skill sets required to really build a great product. And so being clear about what are the different roles that you need to make sure you have something covered by the right type of person is going to be really important. An example could be that it's very common that especially startups, when they're building the first version of their product, they kind of skip through a lot of the stuff I've already talked about today. They either partner up with a developer, right? I've seen people even give equity to early developers, which that's a different topic for a different day. But or they find a freelancer, or maybe they find a company and they just contract for like a certain number of resources, like developers. A regular developer, even a great developer, probably isn't an architect, or they're probably not a DevOps specialist, right? So you don't need someone like a DevOps person or maybe an architect 40 hours a week for a really long time, most of the time, right? These are very specialized skills. Usually the people have a lot of experience doing that particular role, and you need them at the right time for the right depth of involvement, right? Another example would be a very experienced design strategist, not just a UI designer, really a strategist that knows how to sort of look at the product more broadly, how to understand user personas, create user journeys, help ask good questions and facilitate a lot of the conversations that need to happen for you to flush things out. And then really help have it more of a product level or UX level view of the product, right? So being clear on these different roles, you have to have these roles covered. That does not mean that you need a full-time dedicated resource in order to have that coverage. There's a lot of variety today in how you can help cover these, especially if you don't need full-time resources. There's great options for freelancers or contractors, people that sort of moonlight in those roles that could be a good option. Or a lot of firms, even like what we do today at ENO8, will even offer fractional resources that help sort of step into some of these roles on a fractional basis for when you need them, right? So what roles do you need to have accounted for? Next is what specific talent will be really important, right? So what I mean by this is products have different elements to them, right? Sometimes they're particularly technical. Sometimes the challenge is more on the user experience side or the product side. Like, so for example, we had a client a couple years ago where it was more of a marketplace platform, but there was so many different dimensions to the product, right? I mean, there was lots of different user personas that were going to use the system for different things. Their experience would be completely different. And so it was really important for us to have the talent that could help look through those different experiences and make sure that we sort of account for that when we're planning the product, right? The next one is who do I already have on my team? So, it sounds kind of obvious, but take inventory of like what skill sets and what capabilities do I already have on my team? If you're a little bit bigger company, a little further down the road, you may have pretty good capabilities in-house. Maybe you already have a whole engineering team. Maybe you even have a design team. But knowing what you have already and then overlaying that against what you know that you need to figure out where the gaps are can help inform you on here's the main areas where I need to make sure that I plug these holes. One other note on when you're thinking about roles, one that gets overlooked a lot is the resources that help provide perhaps one of the most important elements to a product is sort of overall governance. And what I mean by that is like controlling about what it is that we are going to work on, controlling the scope, controlling the budget, controlling the timeline, making sure that maybe even with the best of intentions, we don't get off a track working on things that aren't directly tied to our immediate validation gates, right? So don't forget about people who are in that governance role. It could be a project manager, could be a delivery lead, could be a combination of both of those, but you really have to have someone who's responsible for that. And in smaller teams, sometimes these different roles are covered by the same person. So it is possible that once you identify these roles, sometimes the same name will be on multiple boxes, right? But if you're going to do that, just make sure that that person really has the capability to cover that role. You don't want a mid-level developer also covering the role of architect. That could be very dangerous, as an example, right? I kind of talked about this one just now. Where are the holes? So once you're clear on what do I have on my team and you're clear about what are the roles that I need to make sure I have covered, then that exposes the holes and that tells you where you need to focus on plugging the holes, right? So the last one here is, what if I misstep on the team I've created? So I think that that's a tricky one and it happens a lot. And it can happen for a lot of different reasons. One of the first things that I would say is really try to be honest with yourself. That can be difficult in this situation because a lot of times you're working with people who are great people and they're working really hard. So it sort of clouds your assessment. But if you feel like something's not going to plan or if things aren't going well, be willing to be sort of brutally honest with yourself, right? Um, the other thing is I would backtrack to these other points that I mentioned earlier on this slide and sort of reassess things. Am I really clear about what do I need, right? And if you need sort of a basic framework for like, what are the basics, what are the must-haves that you need for any sort of product team, reach out to me. I can give you some input on that, and maybe even give you a sort of worksheet that would describe what those roles might be. But I would revisit that, be clear again around like, well, what are the roles that need to be covered? And do I have them covered? Is there a name on every box? And then go through each of those boxes and go, okay, do we feel good about each of these different roles right now? And that helps you dissect like where the problem's coming from, right? And then that could lead to needing to divide up a responsibility a little bit differently. Maybe making a hire, or maybe reaching out to a partner and getting some assistance for one of those specific roles to help shore that up. And then in some cases, it means removing people from the team that just aren't really serving the needs of where the product needs to go. So actually, I misspoke. There's one more item on here, which is assess results and make adjustments. So this is sort of like a periodic revisit of where we're at, right? This one aligns with the validation gates concept I talked about a little bit earlier, but this is know your key metrics, or what I mentioned earlier that I called minimum viable analytics. So know what your success criteria is, know what the metrics are that tie to those success criteria, and make sure you're reviewing that data regularly, right? The next one is involve stakeholders in the review. On one of my first slides, I talked about the importance of aligning stakeholders. Well, a great way to revisit that and continue to have that alignment is revisit your results and review your numbers. And so involve the stakeholders in this periodic review. And this could be reviewing key metrics, but it could be something also like reviewing user feedback or reviewing a demo of the product, right? So again, sort of rechecking your premise, go take a look at what we said we were going to do. Where are we now? Are we on the plan that we said? Do we need to make adjustments before moving forward? So again, it's sort of that theme of keeping alignment among all of your different stakeholders. And I kind of just mentioned a little bit about this, is revisiting your success criteria. When you're in that process of sort of assessing where you're at, it's important to go back to the beginning and recall those success criteria that you came up with before you actually built and launched the product, and gauge where you're at against that success criteria. A lot of times you get down that rabbit hole of building a product, and you get busy, and it's sort of looking one sprint ahead, but it's really helpful and healthy to occasionally back up, look at what your success criteria was, and sort of reassess that against where you're currently sitting. And then the last one here is, what's the next validation gate, right? As you're doing this assessment and you're making adjustments, potentially, you're sort of reviewing your results to see how you've done. Make sure you're really clear on, okay, what's the next validation gate? And regardless of how mature your product is, there's some concept of this validation gate that makes sense, right? And a lot of times you can interchange that with just sort of key objectives, right? Especially as the product gets more mature. Maybe you've gotten way past the point of really getting basic validation, but you need to be clear about, okay, well, what's next on the roadmap? How are we going to know when we've achieved that? And how will we assess those results? So there's a great opportunity to stop, be clear on the next validation gate, define your next objective, and continue moving forward. So to recap, there's basically four main elements to this. There's get clarity, have a plan, assemble the right team, and assess results and make adjustments as needed. So I'll jump into Q&A. If anybody on has a question, feel free to throw that in the Q&A window. I do have two questions that got submitted before that folks asked me to take up. So I'll talk about those while I'm checking to see if there's any other questions that come in. Question number one was, I'm in the middle of a project that's not going well, and let's see, and I didn't do some of the things that you talked about here in the beginning. How do I get it back on track? It may be a little bit of a painful answer, but I think potentially one of the things I would recommend is be willing to hit pause. We've kind of written about this topic a little bit in one of our blog posts. You can find it on our blog at ENO8.com. But if you feel like things are not going well, don't be afraid to hit the pause button or drastically scale back temporarily why you circle back to revisit some of your planning, right? Again, go back to the very first slide. Clarity is the antidote to risk. So if things aren't going well, rather than burn budget while you're continuing to sort of muddle through it, right? Be willing to perhaps scale back or even pause the effort temporarily to focus your energy on revisiting your plan, revisiting how you're going to execute, where the gaps are, how you adjust, and then like resume again, right? So that would be what I would, at a high level, that's what I would say. The next question I had here is, I work with several people on my team that have conflicting opinions on how we should be doing things. How do I know who to listen to? What's the right path? This one comes up a lot, especially with startup companies, founders that maybe don't have a lot of digital product development experience, and they're relying on um, contractors, freelancers, third-party partners, that kind of thing. Um, a lot of working with those types of folks requires building a lot of trust, and a lot of times that takes time, right? There's probably an initial leap of faith based on just best judgment on, should I trust this person or trust this team? Um, but if you're wondering about like how to reconcile different opinions from different people on the team, I would say a couple things. One is, be willing to listen a lot, right? Try to ask good questions. Um, Ask next level questions. Like, okay, I hear you saying this. Can you go a little deeper and tell me why that's your suggestion, and what are some of the alternatives that you considered, right, when deciding on the recommendation? Um, the other option is, don't be afraid to go get an outside opinion on something, especially from someone or a group that doesn't really have a dog in the hunt, right? Like somebody who their best interests aren't aligned to what the truth is or what a suggestion would be. Because especially on big decisions, things like especially like architecture, like sometimes the technical approach on things, those can be ones where there's a lot of differing opinions. And so if you're getting conflicting feedback or input or suggestions from people that you're already working with, it could be a very good investment to spend a little bit of budget to go find a partner or a person or a group that is not tied to the outcome to help assess and give you another opinion, right? And sometimes you might need to get a couple of those, right? Depending on the complexity, the scale of the potential impact of the decision. So that's what I've seen work really well. Architecture is an example. I'm a big fan of like healthy debate on that kind of stuff, because that is one area where there's a lot of different opinions. People can look at the same thing and have very strong different opinions on how something should be done. The other thing about that I would encourage you to do is make sure that you don't get into this trap of making a technical decision purely because it's sort of the purest way of doing something, or it's the very best way or the very cleanest way. In an ideal scenario, of course, we want the cleanest, most elegant, best way of doing it. But you need to balance that with what's the right thing for the product and the business. For instance, if someone has a suggestion for making changes that would create significant refactoring or rework of the architecture, you need to be really clear on what's the business case for this, right? Maybe that's best, right? Maybe that's the purest best way to do it, but you need to balance that with what's best for the product. And that may be that you don't take on that significant of a rework because it doesn't help you meet your next business objective, right? So some thoughts to think about. Hope that helps. I had one last question come in here. How's the technology to be chosen will be based on MLP or based on the complete big picture of the project plan? Man, that's a really good one. So you would be surprised how many times a new product gets selected because of what's best for sort of the near term, but it does not adequately consider what the long-term best technology choices would be for the product. And the flip side of that is also true. Sometimes we see products that are over engineered and the technology choices are way too complicated or not appropriate for that first version, right? And it really hampers their ability to be able to launch a product in the first place, right? So it's a little bit, you have to sort of look at both. You got to look at what's the best, what is sort of our desired future state? Like, how can we build this to know that we wouldn't have to sort of significantly rebuild this anytime in the near future, but also balance that with what's the appropriate solution in the near term. And sometimes that choice that you make up front might surprise you. We had a client a few years ago where their product was a really good idea, but it really needed good validation before we wanted to bury into really building the full scale version of it. And as we were going through our sort of innovation lab that we do with clients, which is our way of sort of doing the planning and getting this clarity on stuff, we had an idea that sounded a little bit odd at first, but there was a proposal like, should we build this in something really simple in a local environment, like using access, right? Which usually you would never choose something like that for like a big scale, product. But in their particular case, it made sense because it was a much lower cost option for building sort of this first version of it. It would get them far enough in their particular use case so that they can get the validation that they needed. And they knew that once they got validation, they would be willing to spend a lot more in order to build out sort of the like long-term version of this. Now, that's kind of an extreme case that doesn't that example doesn't really happen that way that often. But I can tell you that when it comes to like architecture and that kind of thing, you need to consider like what's the way that we'll do this initially, and then longer term, how can we make sure that the decisions we're making now don't really like landlock us to where we would have to significantly rebuild later? That's a great question. I actually had another one come in. It said, while we are converting MVP into a big product, to scale the product, more possible to rework the entire project. What's your opinion on this? So I'm going to reread this again just to make sure I understand. It says, while we are converting an MVP into a big product, to scale the product, is it more possible to rework the entire project? I think yes. So yes is my answer to that. The reason why is this: when you are building the MVP, the risk is really high, right? So if you think about like sort of a graph, when your first version of the product, the risk is much higher for that version of the product than version 20 of the product, right? Because usually by the time you get into future versions of the product, you've got users, you're generating revenue, and you're not investing in a product where there's no revenue coming in order to fund the further product development, right? And so that's the reason why I think it's okay to build something for an MVP that gets you to a validation gate, and then you continue to make changes and improvements and maybe even like rework later on down the road as you got validation, because you may be spending that money, and maybe you would end up spending more money over the long term, but you're forgetting that if you don't pass through the validation gate, then you stop working on it and you save all that money that you would have spent on trying to build this really big, complex, and scalable solution, right? The one caveat, or a caveat, that I would keep in mind on that is that you want to make sure that the nature of your product, let's say the nature of your product is that if it is successful, it could potentially need to super scale really quick and efficiently. That's something you need to be very mindful of when you're making these decisions up front. If your product fits the profile that, hey, if we launch this and this goes really well, it's going to need to scale really fast. If you've architected something that's not going to scale really fast and easily, in that scenario, that could kill your product, right? Because you could have issues with it. Users may not be able to log in. All kinds of different things could happen, and so you need to be mindful of that, right? So just because it needs to be able to super scale doesn't mean it necessarily needs to be like overly complex or over engineered, but just something to keep in mind. Okay, I went about 15 minutes over this time. I hope this is good stuff. think I'm going to mark these questions as answered. So yeah, great questions from everybody. I appreciate you throwing those out there. A little bit of a plug. Here's my contact information. If you guys have any questions about the stuff we talked about today, or even just input, whether you like the content, didn't like it, agreed with it, disagreed with it, I'd love to hear the input either way. So you can drop us an email to info@ENO8.com, or you could always direct message me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. You can also get added to our mailing list. So you can get notified of future episodes of ENO8 Answers. So you can drop an email to info@eno8.com for that as well. As well as I think there's a sign up form on our website. Lastly, a lot of the things that we've talked about here, especially on the planning and clarifying stuff, that's really part of our innovation lab concept that we use with our customers. So if you are curious about that, go out to our website at eno8.com/innovation-lab. We've got a lot of information out there about that. Love talking about it. I'm a huge fan. Obviously, I think it saves our clients like massive money, time, reduces risk significantly. So just a really great way to address a lot of things that we talked about today. I think we're out of time. I appreciate everybody for joining. Again, please pass along your feedback. And if you like these, let somebody know about it so they can join us next time. Look for another one in about a month on a different topic. And until then, have a great month. Thanks, everyone.